In the medieval period, war was not a rare disruption, but a familiar condition that shaped social life. Conflicts occurred constantly between lords' kingdoms, dynasties, and religious powers. Territorial borders were unstable, making disputes over land a common cause of warfare. A fragile treaty could be broken after a single failed harvest or the death of a ruler. There was no concept of lasting peace, only brief pauses between one war and the next. War was inseparable from power, honor, and the survival of the ruling elite. For them, not fighting meant losing land influence or being swallowed by a stronger rival. Violence, therefore, became the primary tool for maintaining order as the medieval world understood it. Ordinary people did not decide wars yet. They bore the heaviest consequences. Villages, farmland, and livestock became direct targets during conflicts. War did not remain confined to battlefields. It spilled into everyday life. Looting, burning, and taking captives were treated as routine elements of military campaigns. There was no modern concept of protecting civilians. On the contrary, inflicting suffering on the population was considered an effective way to weaken the enemy. War was therefore not merely a clash between armies, but a disaster that spread throughout society. Its brutality stemmed from the fact that warfare was deeply embedded in structures of power and survival. It was not a last resort, but the most familiar means of action. In such a context, violence easily exceeded moral limits. Medieval warfare was brutal because it was not restrained by clear humanitarian norms. This reality laid the foundation for conflicts defined by blood and fire. Constant warfare gradually conditioned people to accept violence as a natural part of order. And when violence becomes familiar, cruelty inevitably intensifies. From this backdrop of unending conflict, it becomes necessary to examine how people actually fought. It was the methods of combat themselves that made medieval warfare bloodier than almost any other era. Medieval warfare was fought primarily through close combat, where soldiers faced their enemies at extremely short distances. There were no long-range weapons powerful enough to end battles quickly, so most casualties occurred when opposing formations collided. Swords, axes, maces, spears, and daggers were the main instruments of killing, forcing fighters to see their enemies' faces clearly. Each strike required great physical strength, causing battles to drag on and descend into increasing chaos. When formations broke apart, the battlefield became a confused landscape of blood, mud, and screaming voices. Wounded soldiers who fell were easily trampled or finished off once they could no longer resist. There was no safe way to evacuate the injured while fighting continued. Attempting to flee often meant death, as an unprotected back was vulnerable to pursuit and attack. Close quarters combat pushed the human psyche to extreme brutality. To survive, a soldier had to strike first and hesitate for nothing. Compassion became a dangerous burden amid encircling enemies. Blows were delivered not merely to defeat, but to permanently disable an opponent. Wounds were often severe broken bones, torn flesh, and uncontrollable bleeding. Many did not die instantly, but from blood loss or prolonged agony. When the fighting ended, the field was strewn with corpses and the dying. There were no organized medical units or systems of care. Survivors had to fend for themselves or accept their fate. This method of warfare ensured that every battle resulted in enormous human loss. Violence was neither hidden nor softened. It was experienced in its rawest form by those involved. This intimate proximity to death made medieval warfare uniquely brutal. Fighting at such close range turned violence into a deeply personal and psychologically scarring experience. It allowed no safe distance from the act of killing. From this blood-soaked mode of combat, attention must turn to another factor that intensified the cruelty of war: the weapons and equipment specifically designed to inflict maximum damage on the human body. Medieval weapons were not designed to kill quickly, but to incapacitate enemies through severe and debilitating injuries. Swords, axes, maces, and spears were intended to break armor-crush bones or inflict deep wounds that were slow to heal. Many weapons featured rough edges, sharp points, or spiked surfaces to maximize damage. Maces and warhammers were used to shatter bones through thick armor. Battle axes had heavy blades that could tear flesh and break limbs with a single well-placed strike. Long spears were designed for piercing, creating deep wounds that were difficult to stop from bleeding. Arrowheads were often barbed, making removal far more damaging than the initial impact. Protective equipment was uneven in quality, leaving many soldiers with little real defense. Poor quality armor could easily dent inward, cutting into flesh when struck by a heavy blow. Even well-armored fighters could suffer serious injuries from the sheer force transferred through the armor. Wounds were rarely clean, often contaminated with dirt, mud, and metal fragments. There was no concept of battlefield hygiene, making infection extremely common. Many soldiers survived the fighting only to die later from gangrenous wounds. Weapons did not merely kill, they inflicted prolonged suffering on those who lived. These injuries turned war into a lasting trauma that extended far beyond the moment of combat. Brutality did not end on the battlefield, but continued in the days and weeks that followed. Survivors carried scars, lost limbs, and chronic pain for the rest of their lives. Weapons thus became symbols of enduring violence, not just instant death. They reflected a conception of warfare aimed not at swift resolution, but at the total weakening of the enemy. The very design of medieval weapons contributed significantly to the exceptional cruelty of medieval warfare. Severe injuries ensured that the consequences of war lingered long after the fighting stopped. Pain did not end when the clash of arms fell silent. From weapons and wounds, attention must turn to the treatment of the defeated. It was the fate of the vanquished that pushed the brutality of medieval war to an even darker level. In medieval warfare, defeat did not merely mean losing a battle. It often led to the total destruction of the defeated side. There was no widely accepted concept of protecting prisoners of war, as would emerge in later periods, especially for common soldiers. Captured fighters could be killed immediately on the battlefield to avoid the burden of guarding and feeding them. Those who survived were often stripped of their armor, disarmed, and left among piles of corpses. Noble prisoners might be kept for ransom, but this fate was reserved for only a small minority. Common soldiers and mercenaries rarely held any exchange value. They were easily executed, sold into slavery, or forced into hard labor. Killing the defeated was not seen as cruelty, but as a practical way to end the conflict. Personal vengeance was common, especially when the opposing sides had long-standing feuds. Victory allowed the winners to vent anger and assert power through public violence. Massacres after the battle sometimes proved bloodier than the fighting itself. Severely wounded soldiers who could not flee were often finished off to avoid the trouble of caring for them. There were no strong legal restraints to prevent such actions. The life of the defeated depended entirely on the rare mercy of the victor. Executing prisoners also served as a warning to other potential enemies. The fear of total annihilation drove many forces to fight to the last rather than surrender. This in turn prolonged battles and increased casualties. War thus became an unforgiving spiral between survival and death. Defeat meant not only the loss of life, but erasure from the social order. The fate of the vanquished reflects the profound brutality of medieval warfare. The treatment of the defeated left no room for humanitarian resolution. It encouraged violence to its extreme rather than allowing conflicts to end sooner. From the fate of defeated soldiers, attention must turn to those who suffered most from war. These were civilians, people who bore the heaviest consequences despite never taking up arms. In medieval warfare, civilians were not bystanders, but often the ones who suffered the greatest losses. Villages, farmland, and grain stores became strategic targets meant to weaken the enemy as quickly as possible. Armies passing through an area typically looted, burned, and seized everything they could carry. Homes were set on fire to prevent their use as shelter or supply bases by opposing forces. Fields were destroyed, livestock slaughtered, or driven away, plunging entire regions into prolonged famine. Civilians lost their means of survival long after the battles themselves had ended. Women, children, and the elderly were not regarded as groups deserving protection. They could be taken hostage, forced into labor, or killed to spread fear. Sexual violence also occurred, but was rarely recorded or punished. The terror of war drove many villages to be abandoned, with inhabitants fleeing into forests or fortified towns. Those unable to escape often endured indiscriminate brutality. Civilians had no voice in starting wars, yet paid the price for decisions made by ruling elites. Inflicting suffering on the population was seen as an effective way to force the enemy into submission. There was no clear boundary between the battlefield and everyday life. War invaded hearths, beds, and harvests alike. Entire generations grew up amid hunger and constant violence. The psychological and social consequences lasted far longer than the fighting itself. Civilians became tools of war despite never bearing arms. The cruelty of medieval warfare is therefore measured not by the number of battles, but by the lives it destroyed. Through civilian suffering, medieval war appears as a catastrophe affecting the whole of society. The fate of civilians shows that war was not only brutal on the battlefield, but deeply destructive in daily life. Violence was employed as a strategic instrument, not merely as an unintended consequence. From the suffering of the population, attention must turn to the forces that allowed war to persist and spread. These were fragmented power structures and inherited feuds that endured across generations. One of the deeper reasons medieval warfare was especially brutal lay in the severe fragmentation of power. There was no central authority strong enough to impose lasting peace across an entire territory. Land was divided among numerous lords, each exercising near absolute control within their own domain. A lord's honor and prestige were closely tied to his ability to defend and expand his lands through force. Even a minor dispute over borders or inheritance could escalate into armed conflict. Feuds between noble families often stretched across generations, with little chance of true reconciliation. War thus became not merely a political event, but a continuation of family history. When one lord was defeated, relatives and allies frequently carried on the fight in pursuit of revenge. Peace treaties, when they existed at all, were fragile and easily broken once the balance of power shifted. There were no strong legal mechanisms capable of resolving disputes without resorting to violence. War became the primary means of asserting ownership and social standing. Each conflict sowed the seeds for the next. Fragmented authority allowed violence to spread and made it difficult to contain. There was no clear boundary between major wars and minor skirmishes. Local clashes accumulated into chains of warfare lasting decades. Civilians were drawn into this cycle despite having no direct involvement. War therefore had no decisive endpoint, only temporary pauses. Instability became the normal condition of medieval society. In such a context, limiting violence was nearly impossible. Fragmented power made warfare both persistent and merciless. This divided structure meant no single force could control the violence once it was unleashed. Each lord focused on immediate gain with little concern for long-term consequences. From this fragmentation, attention must turn to another factor that intensified medieval warfare. That factor was the absence of shared laws to restrain behavior during war. Medieval warfare unfolded in a context largely devoid of shared laws strong enough to restrain violence. There was no widely accepted system of rules designed to protect civilians or limit methods of combat. Codes of honor applied only to a small circle of knights and did not govern the battlefield as a whole. Even chivalric ideals were often abandoned when survival or material interests were at stake. Most soldiers were not bound by notions of honor, but acted according to orders and immediate circumstances. Killing, looting, and burning were not considered crimes within the context of war. On the contrary, such acts were often seen as legitimate rewards for the victorious. There were no independent judicial mechanisms to punish brutality that exceeded any reasonable necessity. Actions that inflicted severe suffering on the enemy were frequently encouraged to instill fear. That fear was viewed as an effective strategic tool to force submission. As a result, warfare lacked clear moral boundaries between necessity and cruelty. Soldiers learned to harden themselves emotionally in order to survive prolonged violence. Behaviors condemned in peacetime became normalized on the battlefield. No one bore long-term responsibility for the consequences of the violence inflicted. The absence of limits allowed the level of brutality to escalate with each conflict. When one side resorted to extreme violence, the other often responded in kind or with even greater force. This cycle of retaliation made warfare increasingly difficult to control. There were no common laws capable of halting this spiral once it began. War became a realm in which power alone determined outcomes. It was precisely this lack of restraint that gave medieval warfare its deeply destructive character. The absence of binding rules allowed violence to spread far beyond its original intent. When no limits exist, cruelty becomes the easiest option. From this lack of regulation, attention must turn to another factor that made wars especially difficult to end quickly: the way sieges were conducted and prolonged through suffering. Medieval wars rarely ended quickly, as many conflicts revolved around the capture of heavily fortified strongholds. Rather than engaging in direct battle, opposing sides often chose prolonged sieges to wear the enemy down from within. A besieged city meant the complete cutoff of food, drinking water, and supplies. Civilians inside were forced to share scarce reserves with soldiers, causing hunger to spread rapidly. As provisions dwindled, people were driven to consume things never meant to sustain life for long. Drinking water became contaminated due to poor sanitation, allowing disease to flourish in cramped conditions. Corpses could not be properly buried, further polluting the air and worsening the environment. The elderly, children, and the sick were the first victims of prolonged siege. Morale collapsed as hope for relief faded with each passing day. Outside the walls, the besieging army waited patiently, knowing time was on their side. They established long-term camps, controlled every access point, and blocked all attempts at escape. Anyone who tried to break through the siege was often killed as a warning to those inside. At times, the bodies of the dead were thrown over the walls to spread fear and weaken resistance. When a city finally fell, the violence that had been suppressed for months often erupted with ferocity. Victorious troops looted, killed, and unleashed their rage on residents who had already endured starvation and despair. Siege warfare turned war into a prolonged process of torture rather than a swift confrontation. It killed slowly through hunger, disease, and hopelessness long before swords were drawn. The consequences of a siege were often more devastating than those of major battles. Cities that survived carried lasting collective memories of prolonged suffering. Siege warfare was therefore one of the most brutal forms of medieval conflict. Sieges revealed that war did not kill only with weapons, but with merciless patience. They turned time itself into a weapon as lethal as the sword. From the brutality of siege warfare, attention must turn to another force that intensified medieval violence: the spiritual and religious motivations that drove people beyond all limits of brutality. In many medieval wars, violence did not arise solely from disputes over land, but was also driven by deeply held spiritual beliefs. Religion occupied a central place in daily life, making conflicts easily cloaked in sacred meaning. When war was seen as the will of a higher power, all actions became difficult to question. Soldiers believed that killing the enemy was not only legitimate, but morally justified. The division between the righteous and the heretical stripped the opposing side of its humanity. The enemy was no longer seen as human, but as an obstacle that had to be eliminated. Sermons and teachings that fueled hatred openly encouraged violence. War thus moved beyond political goals and became a form of spiritual purification. Mercy was viewed as weakness when faith was perceived to be under threat. Cruel acts were justified as necessary punishment. Civilians belonging to the opposing side were also seen as complicit and made to suffer the consequences. The destruction of enemy places of worship carried powerful symbolic meaning. Violence was carried out not only to win, but to prove the validity of one's faith. Wars infused with religious meaning often lasted longer and were harder to end through compromise. Compromise was viewed as a betrayal of faith rather than a path to peace. This caused conflicts to escalate beyond their original calculations. When spiritual beliefs were wounded, revenge became limitless. Violence was passed down from generation to generation through memory and doctrine. War thus became a confrontation not only between people, but between belief systems themselves. It was this spiritual motivation that drove brutality to extreme levels. When violence was legitimized by belief, people found it easy to cross all moral boundaries. Cruelty was no longer seen as wrong, but as a duty to be fulfilled. From these spiritual motivations, attention must turn to the long-term consequences war left on society. It is the enduring wounds after war that complete the brutal picture of this era. Medieval war did not end when the clash of weapons fell silent. Its consequences lingered for many years afterward. Regions that had once been battlefields were left desolate, with abandoned farmland and villages reduced to ruins. Surviving populations faced prolonged famine as crops were repeatedly destroyed. Hunger weakened bodies, allowing disease to spread rapidly through already exhausted communities. Those left disabled after war were unable to work, becoming burdens on their families and villages. Wounds that were never properly treated caused lifelong pain. Children grew up amid the remnants of war, becoming accustomed to violence as a normal part of life. Memories of burning and slaughter became deeply embedded in the collective mind. Hatred did not fade, but was passed down through stories and shared remembrance. Old grudges became the seeds of new conflicts. Society struggled to recover as resources were continually drained into the next war. Trust between communities was shattered, making cooperation fragile and rare. Those who had once carried weapons found it difficult to return to peaceful life. Violence became the only skill they knew for survival. They were easily drawn into banditry or new wars whenever opportunity arose. Psychological consequences lasted far longer than physical destruction. War left behind societies deeply wounded and permanently unstable. Even generations that never directly experienced battle inherited its legacy. The brutality of war is therefore not measured by the number of dead, but by the enduring social wounds it leaves behind. Medieval warfare imprinted scars that extended far beyond the moments of combat. These lasting consequences show that war is never a single event. It is a chain of effects that spreads outward, distorting societies for generations. From these outcomes, attention must turn to the final factor that completes this brutal picture: the way war was repeated endlessly, forming an inescapable cycle of the medieval world. Một trong những lý do sâu xa khiến chiến tranh Trung Cổ đặc biệt tàn khốc là việc bạo lực không kết thúc mà tự nuôi dưỡng và lặp lại. Mọi cuộc chiến để lại thù hận, mất mát và bất công chưa được giải quyết. Những mất mát ấy nhanh chóng trở thành lý do chính đáng cho cuộc chiến tiếp theo. Gia đình mặc đất mặc người, mang theo khát vọng phục thù như nghĩa vụ danh dự. Danh dự bị tổn hại được xem là vết nhơ chỉ có thể rửa bằng máu. Trẻ em lớn lên trong câu chuyện về những cái chết chưa được báo thù. Ký ức chiến tranh được truyền miệng như lời cảnh báo và lời kêu gọi hành động. Xã hội không có cơ chế hiệu quả để khép lại xung đột bằng hòa giải. Thỏa hiệp thường bị xem là yếu đuối hoặc phản bội tổ tiên. Vì thế, chiến tranh trở thành phương tiện duy nhất để giải quyết mâu thuẫn kéo dài. Những người từng tham chiến tiếp tục đóng vai trò kích động hoặc dẫn dắt thế hệ sau. Kinh nghiệm bạo lực được coi là vốn liếng quý giá trong xã hội bất ổn. Chiến tranh tạo ra những con người quen với giết chóc khó quay lại đời sống thường nhật. Họ tìm thấy vị trí xã hội và sinh kế trong bạo lực hơn là trong hòa bình. Điều này khiến lực lượng sẵn sàng cấm vũ khí luôn tồn tại. Mọi giai đoạn yên ổn chỉ là khoảng lặng trước đợt xung đột mới. Chiến tranh vì thế không cần lý do mới mà sống nhờ di sản của chính nó. Vòng lặp ấy làm mức độ tàn khốc tăng dần theo thời gian. Bạo lực được tích lũy qua nhiều thế hệ không bị xóa bỏ. Chiến tranh Trung Cổ vì thế giống như căn bệnh mãn tính của xã hội. Vòng lặp chiến tranh cho thấy bạo lực không chỉ là hành động mà là cấu trúc xã hội. Khi cấu trúc ấy tồn tại, chiến tranh khó có thể chấm dứt bằng một chiến thắng đơn lẻ. Từ vòng xoáy bạo lực ấy cần khép lại bằng cái nhìn tổng thể về nguyên nhân sâu xa. Chính sự kết hợp của mọi yếu tố đã làm chiến tranh Trung Cổ trở nên tàn khốc đặc biệt. One of the deepest reasons medieval warfare was especially brutalized in the fact that violence did not end. It sustained itself and repeated endlessly. Each war left behind hatred, loss, and unresolved injustice. These losses quickly became the very justification for the next conflict. Families who lost land or loved ones carried the desire for revenge as a matter of honor. Wounded honor was seen as a stain that could only be washed away with blood. Children grew up hearing stories of deaths that had not yet been avenged. Memories of war were passed down orally as both warnings and calls to action. Society lacked effective mechanisms to truly close conflicts through reconciliation. Compromise was often viewed as weakness or betrayal of one's ancestors. As a result, war became the only accepted means of resolving long-standing disputes. Those who had once fought often continued to incite or lead the next generation. Experience with violence was treated as valuable capital in an unstable society. War produced individuals accustomed to killing, unable to return to ordinary civilian life. They found social standing and livelihood in violence rather than in peace. This ensured a constant pool of people ready to take up arms. Every period of calm was merely a pause before the next outbreak of conflict. War no longer required new causes, it fed on its own legacy. This cycle caused brutality to intensify over time. Violence accumulated across generations instead of being erased. Medieval warfare thus resembled a chronic disease embedded within society itself. This recurring cycle shows that violence was not merely an action, but a social structure. As long as that structure endured, war could not be ended by a single victory. From this spiral of violence, the narrative must close with a broader perspective on the underlying causes. It was the combination of all these factors that made medieval warfare uniquely and profoundly brutal. Looking at the full picture, the brutality of medieval warfare was not the result of people being inherently more cruel than in other eras. Rather, it was the inevitable outcome of a society structured around violence, honor, and survival. Fragmented power made war the primary tool for resolving conflict. Close quarters combat forced people to kill at intimate distances, leaving no room for mercy. Weapons were designed to inflict prolonged suffering, turning each battle into a spectacle of bodily destruction. The defeated were afforded no protection, making loss equivalent to annihilation. Civilians became strategic targets, sacrificed to serve military victory. Prolonged sieges transformed hunger and disease into highly effective weapons of death. Religious belief legitimized violence, pushing people beyond moral limits. The consequences of war stretched across generations, nurturing new hatred and instability. War did not truly end, it repeated itself in an inescapable cycle. In such a context, compassion became a luxury. People acted according to the logic of their age, where survival outweighed humanitarian concerns. There was no legal system strong enough to restrain violence once unleashed. War became a familiar condition rather than an exception. Its brutality was therefore not a historical accident, but a structural feature of medieval society. Only when power became more centralized and ethical norms of warfare began to form did levels of violence gradually decline. Throughout the Middle Ages, however, such conditions remained beyond society's reach. War most clearly reflected the limits of humanity when faced with fear of loss and the desire for control. And from those limits, history bequeathed an era marked by bloodshed and enduring trauma. The brutality of medieval warfare is not merely a story of swords and battles. It is the story of a society that had not yet found a way out of violence. Understanding this allows us to view the past with clarity rather than judgment, for only by recognizing the roots of brutality can humanity hope to avoid repeating it in the future.